Less than 48 hours. That is the timeline. The timeline of the greatest economic betrayal in modern urban history. When New York City's leadership, led by Zoran Mamdani, implemented a sweeping indefinite rent freeze, a policy they said was meant to solve a crisis, they instead detonated an immediate catastrophic crisis of confidence. This single act, this act of political ideology aimed at punishing the few, has completely destabilized the financial trust of the many. Financial veterans are calling the fallout a hydrogen bomb dropped directly on Manhattan's economy. And the consequence? The guardians of the city's tax base, they're booking one-way tickets out. This is triggering fears of billions in write-downs and a fiscal collapse that could just hollow out the city's ability to fund its own services. This isn't about politics. This is about mathematics. How quickly can the perceived safety of private capital be dismantled by political fiat? And what are the severe, irreversible implications for the average worker who is left behind to witness the decline? Stay with us as we break this down in our in-depth discussion right here on News Focus Podcast. And if you find our reporting valuable, please hit the like button and subscribe to support our channel. We truly appreciate it. The speed of this reaction, as we begin this deep dive, is probably the most shocking part of it all. 48 hours. The policy was hailed by its proponents as a victory for tenants, a necessary corrective to inflation and predatory pricing. Yet within 2 days, the narrative on the ground, it shifted entirely to panic. We're getting reports that phones at luxury real estate offices are, quote, melting down. Moving trucks are double parked in front of penthouses across Manhattan. So we have to start by defining the mechanism of the policy itself. What exactly was implemented, and why did its specific nature cause such an immediate and frankly seismic reaction among capital holders?
Well, the key mechanism here, and you're right, it's why the reaction was so instantaneous, is the sheer extremity and, most importantly, the indefinite nature of the mandate.
Indefinite.
Yes. This wasn't a one-year cap or, an inflation-tied freeze. The policy is defined as an indefinite rent freeze imposed across all rent-stabilized units. And the language you hear from investors reacting to this is sharp. They're saying this isn't just rent capping, which is already a complex and often criticized policy. This is a complete arbitrary assertion of government control over private asset valuation. It effectively vaporizes the very notion of predictable property rights.
So, in essence, the government, not the market, not supply and demand, not even a calculated CPI increase, the government now gets to decide what a property is worth. Forever.
Exactly. And that is the analysis point that instantly vaporized confidence in New York's real estate markets. To really get the gravity of this, you have to look at it from an investor's perspective.
Yeah.
Whether they are, major hedge fund titans or just small-time property owners, the underlying trust in the sanctity and predictability of property rights is the bedrock of their entire investment. I mean, if I, as an investor, commit capital for 20 or 30 years, I factor in calculated risks, market downturns, interest rate changes, even some expected regulatory changes.
Right, that's all part of the model.
It's all part of the model.
Uh-huh.
But when a government can unilaterally and indefinitely freeze the income-generating potential of a major asset class, it fundamentally breaks the contract between the state and the capital holder. The perceived risk immediately skyrockets past any calculable measure. It turns a stable, cash flow producing asset into basically a non-performing asset whose value is subject entirely to political whim.
Which makes it impossible to invest in.
It makes long-term investment in that asset class, and by extension the city that governs it, completely illogical. The speed of the reaction shows this wasn't some measured, expected change. It was a radical, ideological shift that broke foundational economic assumptions. It signaled to investors everywhere that New York is no longer a safe place for capital.
Let's address the intent for a moment, just to maintain our impartial reporting here. Proponents of this, Mamdani's administration, they argued that the market was broken, that tenants were suffering from crushing inflation, and that this measure was absolutely necessary to ensure basic housing security and prevent mass displacement. What's the counter-argument the financial community is making to that?
Well, the financial community would acknowledge the housing difficulty, but their response is brutal in its economic clarity. They say the road to poverty is paved with good intentions. They argue that this policy, it misdiagnoses the problem and applies a poisonous cure. If the goal is housing security, the established economic consensus is that freezing the price only addresses the symptom, the high rent, while intensifying the root cause.
which is a lack of supply.
which is the lack of supply. By making investment impossible, the city ensures that the existing housing stock will never be adequately maintained or replaced, guaranteeing a future shortage. The financial argument is that stability requires supply, and supply requires the confidence that capital will be rewarded, not, seized.
And the terminology that has sprung up on trading floors really hammers home this idea of broken trust. We have to talk about the quote from billionaire investor Cliff Asness, founder of AQR Capital. He described Mamdani's rent freeze plan as a hydrogen bomb dropped on the city's economy. That is not casual language.
No, it's hyperbolic for sure, but it serves a crucial purpose. It's providing context for the level of systemic destabilization we are seeing. The hydrogen bomb analogy isn't just about the financial loss of existing rental income. It speaks to a policy so extreme that it destabilizes all perceived value in the urban environment.
So far beyond just the rent-stabilized properties themselves.
Far beyond. When a radical policy like this is implemented, investors immediately run what they call contagion risk models. They ask, if the government can do this to residential properties today, what stops them from targeting commercial leases tomorrow? Or other income streams like licensing fees? The fear is that the city has moved from predictable governance to arbitrary political action. Fund managers, developers, economists, they're all warning about how fragile urban capital really is. Capital, you have to remember, is digital. It's highly mobile. It flees instantaneously the moment policies suggest arbitrary seizure or indefinite control. It's the speed of light compared to the speed of construction.
And are we seeing evidence of this flight already accelerating? The sources suggest the immediate response from high-net-worth clients wasn't contemplation, it was action. It was accelerating movement that was maybe already planned.
Oh, absolutely. Wealth managers in Midtown are reporting a phenomenon they're calling the final straw. Many high-net-worth clients already had these pre-existing dormant exit strategies because of high city and state income taxes.
Right, this isn't a new idea for them.
Not at all. But this policy activated those strategies instantly. They are looking to lock in Florida addresses before what they fear will be the next tax wave hits.
And the logic there is what?
The logic seems to be, if the government is willing to destroy the property rights of one class of investors, they will undoubtedly turn their attention to raising income taxes on those who remain to cover the budget shortfall that's about to hit.
The comparison being made by one luxury realtor is particularly poignant. They're calling it 2020 all over again, but on steroids.
That is a powerful analogy. It draws on the memory of the COVID lockdowns, but suggests this economic lockdown is self-inflicted and, potentially more permanent.
How so?
In 2020, people fled physical and health risks. Many assumed they'd eventually return when the virus subsided. This time, the policy itself is the contagion. It's the risk. The source material indicates the flight is being driven by a fundamental disbelief that New York, which once symbolized American capitalism, is now torching its own empire under this new banner of ideological policy.
So the feeling is that if the government can just devalue one asset class today,
they have no faith in the stability of any other asset tomorrow. The trust is gone.
Let's transition to the numbers now, because anxiety, as we know, quickly translates into quantifiable figures on Wall Street. We need to detail the measurable financial fallout. Within hours of this policy, what specific concrete actions were taken beyond just phone calls? We know hedge funds started running new models. What were the ugly numbers they came up with?
The financial consequences were almost instantaneous because it's just simple math. Property valuation is based on expected income. If income is capped indefinitely, value drops proportionally. So the first warnings were of billions of dollars in potential write-downs in property valuations across the affected zones.
And this isn't theoretical.
No, not at all. This is the immediate calculation of expected revenue loss translated into asset depreciation. Investment banks and fund managers are using revised capitalization rates, or cap rates. So if you have a cap rate of, say, 5%, and your net operating income, your NOI, is cut by 20% because of the freeze, the total valuation for that asset immediately drops by 20%. It's a direct one-to-one hit.
And that drop in valuation, that feeds directly into the banking sector, right? This is what triggers what the sources are calling systemic risk and panic among landlords.
It creates a crisis in the credit markets.
Yeah.
Landlords, both the major firms and the small individual investors, operate with leverage. They have loans secured by the value of their property. That's the collateral. So they called their banks immediately, panicked that they couldn't meet crucial loan-to-value or LTV covenants. This is a critical point that we should probably unpack a bit.
Yeah, let's unpack LTV covenants, because this sounds like where the policy moves from just a political fight to a full-blown banking crisis.
It is, absolutely. Lenders will typically insist that the loan amount never exceeds a certain percentage of the property's value, often around 60% to 75%. That's the LTV covenant.
Okay.
So if the market value of the collateral suddenly drops, as it did here because of the income cap, the LTV ratio spikes past the agreed-upon threshold. The bank can then issue a margin call.
Which means they need more cash.
It means they need more cash immediately. They require the borrower, the landlord, to inject new capital to restore the proper ratio. If the landlord can't do this, they are in technical default. And since billions in collateral value were erased overnight, this put thousands of loans into immediate jeopardy.
So the landlords are suddenly facing these massive, unbudgeted cash calls or the threat of foreclosure simply because the government changed the rules of the game overnight.
Precisely. And this forced immediate, desperate responses. We're hearing many owners quietly began what's being called panic selling in an attempt to offload buildings before new, lower appraisals hit the market. They're trying to lock in significant losses before the banks officially issue default notices.
Which is just a tragic irony.
It is. The policy intended to protect tenants is causing a fire sale that destabilizes the very banks that fund the entire housing market.
So the ripple effect isn't just on the books of existing owners. It's on the flow of future investment. Analysts are warning this is the spark that could light a decade-long capital flight.
Beyond existing investments, what about future growth and development?
The impact on future growth is perhaps even more devastating than the immediate write-downs of existing assets. The sources detail a profound chilling effect across all related sectors. Financing is freezing up immediately. Immediately. Lenders are conducting a risk reevaluation on all New York City real estate, and that includes projects that are market rate and not even subject to rent stabilization.
Sure, because the risk assessment has just fundamentally changed. It has. The thinking is, if the government can do this to one part of the housing market, who's to say they won't expand the definition of emergency measures tomorrow? This fear of policy creep means capital isn't just leaving the affected buildings, it's abandoning the city as a whole. Developers are pulling back. Construction firms are shelving new projects. When the financing dries up and the return on investment is eliminated or artificially capped, construction just stops.
And the consequence of that construction stoppage hits the working class directly. The very people Mamdani claimed he was helping.
It absolutely does. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of high-wage essential jobs, construction, plumbing, electrical work, architecture, engineering, related finance sectors, all now reportedly at risk. The policy, while it's framed as housing justice, is creating a confidence crisis that directly impacts employment and the long-term health of our infrastructure.
So he might have promised stability for some tenants.
But what's been delivered is a slow-motion collapse of the system required to build, finance, and maintain future housing. The irony here is that by destroying the supply side, the government guarantees that future housing will be even more expensive and scarce for the next generation of workers.
This panic now has a name, which really cements its place in New York's economic history: the Mamdani migration, or the Second Great Escape. We've detailed the financial models, but let's talk about the human element of this movement. Where is this capital actually fleeing to?
The sources confirmed this is highly active. It's not just talk. We're hearing real estate insiders report contracts being canceled, multi-million-dollar deals being torn up in real time, checks being refunded, and the physical movement, it's highly focused geographically. Anecdotally, private jets are reportedly warming up at Teterboro, which is the preferred airport for high-net-worth individuals.
And their destinations are strikingly uniform, I understand.
They are. The flight destinations are largely consistent: Palm Beach, Naples, Miami, and Fort Lauderdale. These areas are described as buzzing with calls from ex-New Yorkers who are desperate to establish Florida residency. Specifically, they want to do it before any subsequent New York tax policy changes hit. This movement isn't just about minor tax savings anymore. It's a wholesale rejection of New York's governance model.
So why Florida specifically, beyond just the tax angle? What does Florida represent that New York no longer does to this class of capital?
In a word, stability, predictability. Florida and other low-tax states like Texas are actively positioning themselves as jurisdictions where the government views capital as a partner, not an enemy. The people leaving are the ones who create high-value jobs, hedge fund partners, business owners, major developers. They view New York's actions as economic self-sabotage, and they're choosing jurisdictions where they feel their productivity is rewarded, not condemned.
It's a psychological vote of no confidence.
It's a complete vote of no confidence in New York's long-term sanity.
Now we have to shift from the concerns of the fleeing investors to the broader economic structure and the fear of a systemic death spiral. This is where the policy failure becomes a public safety issue. Critics identify a fundamental flaw here. The city's tax base funds everything: the NYPD, the MTA, public schools, and Mamdani's social programs. And the phrase being used is blunt. You can't fund utopia when your ATM machines are moving to Florida.
This is the most brutal and critical aspect of the entire analysis, and it speaks to the hypocrisy of the policy. Fiscal watchdogs are already warning that New York could lose billions of dollars in income tax revenue by spring. And the loss is concentrated at the very top, which is the city's lifeblood. To understand the magnitude of this, we have to look at the fiscal math.
Yeah, let's break down that critical math point again for clarity.
Certainly. The critical fact, according to the sources, is that the top 1% of earners in New York City contributes an astounding half of the city's entire tax base. Half. Think about that staggering imbalance. Therefore, even if only, say, 3% or 5% of this top 1% migrate, it translates into a budget hole of such magnitude, hundreds of millions, potentially billions, that it creates a massive fiscal earthquake. The irony is just palpable. Mamdani's welfare expansion and social programs depend entirely on the same high-income taxpayers that his policy is driving out the door through regulatory aggression.
So fewer millionaires inevitably means fewer resources for essential city services.
Exactly. The result is a guaranteed decline in the quality of life for everyone who remains. Fewer millionaires translates directly into fewer resources for essential city services. Fewer teachers, fewer cops, fewer MTA upgrades. It means an overall decay in infrastructure and public safety. The city cannot afford to run its operations if its wealthiest 10,000 households decide to relocate their income tax residency.
And this leads us to the terrifying economic concept that is now being used to describe New York's predicted collapse: the death spiral. Explain the precise mechanism of this spiral for our listeners, referencing that fiscal hole you just described.
The death spiral is a compounding, destructive feedback loop of decline. We've seen it in cities that failed to adapt to capital flight. It begins with this policy-induced exodus, the Mamdani migration, which creates a massive multi-billion-dollar fiscal hole.
Right.
So the city, needing to maintain services or fund new programs, must then turn to the remaining population, the middle and upper middle class, and raise taxes dramatically to plug that revenue hole.
But raising taxes is exactly what drove the first wealthiest wave of earners away.
And that is the fatal flaw in the spiral's logic. The tax increase drives more remaining high-income and even middle-class earners away because the cost of staying becomes fiscally unbearable. This accelerated exodus then makes the fiscal hole even bigger, requiring further steeper tax hikes on an even smaller base of remaining taxpayers, which leads to more flight and on and on. The cycle is described simply as rinse, repeat, collapse.
A self-feeding loop.
Exactly. And historically, cities that enter a fiscal death spiral find that their infrastructure rapidly crumbles, schools face deep operational cuts, and the fundamental promise of a functioning city just cannot be funded when the financiers and high-wage earners have fled. The claim here is stark. The infrastructure of fairness cannot be built on an insolvent tax base.
While the elites can afford the private jets to Florida, and the very poor may remain in place, the sources suggest it is the crucial middle class that is getting crushed. Who exactly are these casualties, and what is the internal contradiction of the policy that targets them?
The middle-class casualty group is defined by the sources as those who are too rich for help but too poor to escape. This includes nurses, small business owners, freelancers, and, perhaps most ironically given the policy's intent, small landlords.
Right, not the massive institutional firms.
Not at all. These are often retirees, teachers, or average working families who invested in a duplex or a small building, a 4 or 6 unit brownstone, as their retirement income.
The narrative often targets a parasite landlord, but the reality painted here is far more nuanced, suggesting the policy is devastating its intended, smaller target group more effectively than the institutional titans.
It is the critical internal contradiction. The sources emphasize that it is these small, non-billionaire landlords who are being disproportionately destroyed, Unlike institutional owners who can absorb large losses across a massive diversified portfolio, the small landlord cannot absorb an indefinite rent freeze while still dealing with rapidly rising property taxes, insurance premiums, and maintenance costs due to national inflation.
So their income is frozen, but their costs are not.
Not even close. For a small landlord, the policy caps their ambition and their income. It essentially forces them to subsidize tenants without the vast capital reserves of institutional investors, turning their modest retirement asset into a net liability.
Can we put some numbers to the pressures they're facing? When we say small landlords are destroyed, what percentages are we talking about here for their rising costs?
We need to remember that while their income is frozen, their expenses are moving aggressively with inflation. Property taxes and municipal water bills, they typically rise annually, often by several percentage points. Insurance premiums, particularly in high-risk zone, their older buildings, have skyrocketed, sometimes increasing by 15% or 20% year over year.
Wow.
But the critical hit is maintenance. A major boiler replacement, for example, which might have cost $40,000 3 years ago, now costs $55,000 due to inflation in materials and labor. When the income stream to cover these massive essential costs is capped at zero growth, the small landlord is financially insolvent within a very short period.
And this policy, while cheered by some renters as, free money, it carries massive unforeseen risks for them as well.
Absolutely. The consequence of destroying the small landlord base is the physical decline of the housing stock. When owners stop investing because they can't afford to maintain the properties or they see no return on capital, they defer maintenance. Buildings decay, roofs leak, heating systems fail, and neighborhoods start to look neglected. Eventually, this leads to safety code violations and, ironically, higher living costs for the tenant through increased utility bills in poorly maintained properties.
So it's a race to the bottom.
The analysis suggests that what Mamdani promised as equity is now turning into an equality of misery, where affordable housing just means dilapidated housing.
One radio caller captured that despair perfectly. Too rich for help, but you're too poor to escape. That is the sound of a city collapsing inward, forced to watch its own decline.
It speaks to the devastating reality for those trapped in what's being called the blue state grind. The hard-working individuals who love New York but cannot justify funding its self-inflicted economic decline. They are the ones left behind to face the escalating taxes and crumbling infrastructure caused by the exodus of the high-income earners. The initial goal of equity is, ironically, directly causing a systemic decline that hurts those who can least afford to live, forcing them into a decaying city environment.
The chaos in New York has not gone unnoticed on the national stage. The Trump administration has reportedly responded directly to this crisis, using the failure as a philosophical and political cudgel against ideological governance. What was the presidential rebuke that landed like a sledgehammer across every blue state capital?
Standing on the South Lawn, President Trump reportedly stated very bluntly, "You don't build prosperity by chasing it away." That statement, according to the sources, represents a complete 180-degree contrast to New York's message of, punishment and redistribution. It frames the NYC policy not as a well-intentioned failure, but as an act of fundamental self-destruction.
So analyze the administration's strategy here. It seems designed not just to criticize, but to strategically capitalize on the failures of states like New York. It's turning governance into a competition.
That is the core strategy. The administration's message is simple and direct. Reward productivity, not dependency. They are reminding the country that true leadership means creating the conditions for success, minimizing risk, and ensuring predictable returns, not driving capital out of town. It's a clear philosophical divergence that plays out politically. While New York is doubling down on ideology, the federal message is that capital will flow where it is treated the best. They're arguing that pro-growth policy isn't partisan, it's patriotic.
And New York's decline becomes their proof.
New York's decline, in this view, becomes the greatest, most immediate vindication of the administration's entire economic philosophy.
And this pro-business agenda is being rolled out with specific policy tools aimed at attracting the capital that's fleeing New York. They're being called freedom investment corridors or freedom zones. This sounds like a direct counter-strategy in the migration war.
It is a deliberate economic warfare strategy. The administration is reportedly working directly with governors such as Ron DeSantis in Florida to implement these zones. They are essentially creating rescue boats for survivors of a shipwreck, focusing on attracting the capital, the corporations, and the high-value human talent that New York is expelling.
So the goal is explicit.
The explicit goal is to incentivize companies and capital-fleeing failing states to relocate to low-tax regions that offer a dramatically more welcoming regulatory environment.
So detail the incentives being offered by these red states that are standing by, like rescue boats. What specific differences are they highlighting in terms of governance?
The package is tailored to appeal directly to the physical and psychological needs of the capital class. First, the most obvious, zero state income tax, which is a massive immediate draw for high earners who are paying up to 13% in New York State.
Right.
Second, they promise pro-growth zoning and expedited permitting. This addresses the bureaucratic nightmare developers face in New York, where projects can be stalled for years in red tape. In a freedom zone, the promise is regulatory streamlining and speed real freedom to operate.
It's about predictability.
It's entirely about predictability. Furthermore, these zones are designed to promise legislative predictability. The implicit agreement is, we won't change the rules on you after you've already invested. The message from the White House is that states must compete for investment, and by engaging in policies like the indefinite rent freeze, New York has essentially forfeited that competition.
And this isn't just policy. It's become personal. We are seeing public antagonism between the states, described as trolling. This migration has a sharp edge of schadenfreude to it.
The public antagonism is intense because the stakes are so high. Billions in tax revenue are shifting state lines. Former Manhattan CEOs are publicly praising Trump's initiatives, calling the freedom zones a lifeboat for the working wealthy. But the most colorful detail, illustrating the psychological warfare, involves the Florida realtors. They are reportedly trolling New York with full-page ads reading, "Bring your business, leave your state tax behind."
That highlights the resentment factor you mentioned earlier, the feeling of being trapped and overtaxed to fund what the leavers see as political self-destruction.
It absolutely underscores the resentment and anger boiling over among those still trapped in that blue state grind. They feel they are funding self-inflicted decline. The message is clear. If the math doesn't make sense and the policy demonizes productivity, people will go where their success is celebrated, not condemned.
So the very people who might have once looked down on those states are now moving there.
The source material notes that many who once mocked Florida as Trump country, or a backward state, are now the ones frantically calling realtors in Miami and Fort Lauderdale, begging for residency advice. The ideology of the past is yielding to the reality of the balance sheet.
This brings us to the ultimate critique of the Mamdani policy, a philosophical breakdown of governance and policy effectiveness. Wall Street economists are reportedly saying that New York has declared war on math itself.
Well,
what is the fundamental failure behind such an extreme statement?
the critique is that the policymakers implemented a solution based purely on moral indignation, and they completely ignored fundamental economics. It creates a recipe for disaster where the policy outcomes defy basic reality. The sources highlight the internal inconsistency, the mathematical contradiction. You cannot freeze rent while heating inflation up.
Let's detail that paradox using a real-world example because this is the crux of the war on math.
Okay, so consider the expense side for a landlord. Inflation continues to increase the cost of labor, materials, insurance, and utilities, often at rates exceeding 5% or 7% annually.
For example,
A commercial insurance policy might renew 15% higher. The cost of a major roof repair may be 20% higher than last year. These are non-negotiable costs. However, the rent freeze caps the income required to cover those costs indefinitely at 0% growth. The landlord is operating under two separate economic laws. Inflationary cost increases met by frozen income. This is mathematically unsustainable. It guarantees insolvency and eventually deferred maintenance.
it's a collision course.
It is. The argument is that the policy attempts to repeal the law of supply and demand. You can't regulate your way to prosperity, you can't tax your way to fairness, or demonize productivity without ultimately destroying progress. The sad irony, as noted in the sources, is that the people cheering the loudest for subsidized or free housing will be the first to suffer when there is simply nobody left to maintain the buildings or fund the essential city services.
The decline being reported is not just economic, it's moral and physical, a physical manifestation of the fiscal crisis. The sources paint a picture of the city becoming a cautionary tale. Describe the physical evidence of decay now reportedly visible and how it connects to the policy failure.
The physical decay is directly connected to the policy failure and the ongoing denial from the city's leadership. When the tax revenue stream begins to dry up, Funding for essential services like sanitation, police presence, and MTA maintenance is immediately impacted. The sources report seeing storefronts tagged with graffiti, reflecting a declining sense of order. Business owners are whispering that they just don't feel safe after dark, indicating a decline in public safety that is psychological but also measurable.
This creates that negative feedback loop again.
Yeah.
People leave due to high cost and low quality of life, which reduces the tax base, which then reduces the quality of life even further.
Exactly. The image presented is of a city where the soul is flickering out, a sharp contrast to the city that once bragged about being the safest in America. The fiscal hole translates into fewer cops on the beat, slower response times, dirtier subways. And critically, this physical chaos is happening while the city's leaders continue to preach fairness and equity, seemingly oblivious to the economic fire they started.
Yet denial.
That denial is described as the final insult. The leaders may preach fairness and equity, but they are ignoring the visible chaos and the crumbling infrastructure right outside their office windows. The decline is seen as moral because the denial of fundamental economic reality is leading to a decay in public safety and the common good, ultimately harming the most vulnerable people who can't escape.
The lights are on, but the system is eroding from within.
That's a good way to put it.
So synthesizing all these points, the immediate exodus, the frozen investment, the death spiral math, and the physical decay, what is the core lesson being drawn from this rapid collapse of confidence and flight of capital?
The core lesson, as it's being summarized in the financial sources, is that policymakers must never confuse compassion with competence. The intention of fairness, if it's executed through policies that defy basic economic math and violate established property rights, leads to guaranteed destruction. The observation being drawn is profound. When you attack the people who build and fund the infrastructure, the whole system eventually collapses.
And that system collapse is what we are seeing in real time. A rapid exodus of the very foundation required to fund the city's ideals, accelerated by a policy that was designed to achieve the exact opposite of what it is delivering.
Exactly. The lesson is that once the money leaves, the city eventually follows. The empire that was built on ambition and financial stability is now running out of time, and the contrast with the booming red states that are rewarding productivity is serving as a painful proof point for the entire nation. Mamdani may have lit the fuse with the rent freeze, but the city's voters handed him the match when they chose a policy that was disconnected from economic reality. Thank you. And thank you to our listeners.
That's all for this deep dive. But it leaves us with one haunting question for every metropolitan area grappling with high taxation and ideological policy. If a system drives out the very foundation required to fund its ideals, is the outcome truly progress, or simply the slow-motion collapse of an empire?